So thank you. Thank you for your service, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. And if there are a few seats up here, if you can tolerate being in the front, so just wanted to let you know. So I got involved in national service actually predating the Clinton administration when I was working for Senator Kennedy on Capitol Hill, and I was working in the education office for the Senate Labor Committee, and this idea came up that maybe if people wanted to get financial aid for college, they ought to give something back. And there was an effort that the Democratic Leadership Council, which at the time Governor Clinton was involved with, was kind of pushing this idea on and the notion was that if there were a sense that people were earning their benefits, then there would be a stronger political base to support them. So they put this idea forward as a provocative idea to get the conversation going, and the liberals in Congress were kind of freaked out because they kind of thought if we did that, then a lot fewer people would go to college, and I think that's in fact true. But it really started a conversation among policymakers that has yielded, I think, one of the most effective social programs we have today, which I'm going to talk about. So the first bill I worked on was really a demonstration program to see if there was if anybody wanted to serve, because it was kind of untested. Would this work if you actually put out there the opportunity to serve full-time for a year in exchange for some kind of education benefits? Would anybody show up? And in fact, one of the first programs funded under that demonstration program, City Year, and in fact people were showing up, and it was seemingly rather successful. So then Bill Clinton decided to run for president. And he had lots of ideas, and one of the policy ideas that he liked to put out on the campaign trail was, how about if we let everybody who serves for a year or two, what if we give them money for college? Now, this is a little different than what the Democratic Leadership Council proposed, because they were saying initially, we're going to take away all the financial aid, and unless you did service, you won't get any money. This said, we'll keep financial aid, but we're going to reward those people who serve with extra resources. And that was wildly popular on the campaign trail. So when President Clinton took office, he had to come up with a structure and a bill to kind of make that campaign promise real. And I happened at the time, I was working for First Lady Hillary Clinton in the Office of the First Lady. I was her first policy assistant on the Domestic Policy Council, her representative, and she kind of, since I'd already had a little background in service, and they'd actually managed to staff the entire National Service Office in the White House with people who knew absolutely nothing about national service, they lent me, Mrs. Clinton lent me to her husband to work on this proposal. And to give you a sense of like how quick, this was a crazy time, right? So they're doing health care reform. They're dealing with don't ask, don't tell. They are going through lots and lots of political hoo-ha, and Hillary's getting letters every day that say things like, really awful stuff, like, why are you doing policy? In the meantime, this little group of people are working on this legislation and trying to negotiate a bill that will pass Congress. And part of the thinking behind it was that it couldn't just be about student aid. It couldn't just be about opportunity to go to college, because the bar would be pretty high in terms of wanting to get lots of people out there. And if you just did that one thing, it's a pretty expensive way to give people money for college. So they had to do something really important in communities. So we worked out a whole deal, and this is this working? Just do it this way, the old-fashioned way. No, that's not working either. Well, while he works on that, I'll tell you the story. So, we were, we had the bill done in the first 100 days of the administration, which was really fast, and it actually passed with bipartisan support in September of 1993. So within 9 months of President Clinton taking office, we had President Clinton coming over the hill with people who were in some of the existing programs that were sort of models and part of the demonstration programs. And we had this huge signing ceremony. And I will say that the night before, we didn't know whether it was going to be called AmeriCorps or Corps America. And there was like this kind of big fight going on. I have to say I was a Corps America person, and I think I was wrong. But we came out with AmeriCorps and had to figure out then how to implement it. So we spent a year working really hard to put together the actual program. And one of the big questions we had was, should this be, where should the emphasis be? Should this be about changing lives of people who serve? Or should this be about changing communities? Or should this be about building a better citizen responsibility ethic in America? And we kind of came out that it had to be about all three. And that actually programs that were going to participate had to create measurable outcomes in all three areas. And for those of you who kind of work in nonprofit world, you'll know that that's now the state of the art. Everybody has to have measurable outcomes. But this was like 1993, and people didn't even know what they were. But we ended up wanting to put the emphasis on, does this work now? Yes, awesome. On this sort of idea that it was about solving problems in the community. So our motto was getting things done, and I remember the T-shirts that were designed to be the first uniforms, and in fact continue to be the uniforms for AmeriCorps, are like this gritty gray color, because the idea was that it was like muscular, and you were going to get out there and you're going to get dirty and you're going to really make a difference. And honestly, I think those were all pretty good decisions. And over the last, now over 15 years, over 700,000 people have served in AmeriCorps, which is pretty amazing. And it's a force that is making all kinds of difference all over the country, and it's largely invisible. So what's happening is, all these terrific things are going on in schools. We're getting these great outcomes, and I'm going to tell you about some of them in a minute. But it's become kind of like its own silo. So when people in policy talk about different issue areas, and they'll say, well, it's very siloed, that kind of means that, we're tackling unemployment, but we're not dealing with root causes like education. Or we've got a program that's going to help do one thing, and there's no attention or attempts to kind of knit together all of the resources that'll actually solve a problem. And so what I sort of saw happening is that service has become its own silo. Everybody in service is for service, and nobody else has heard of it. Or everybody who's in it really is, kind of very enthusiastic, and their mother can't even explain what they do. So I started worrying about that, because not only because that's not good for the program and its sort of long-term health, but also because, I get to sit in a lot of rooms in Washington, the Center for American Progress, there's lots of people who work on environment and they work on education. And, I get to sit in kind of meetings with my clients about, like, how do we solve these problems? And honest to God, nobody ever says, well, tell me what the volunteer solution should be. What's the role for ordinary citizens? What's the role for AmeriCorps? Can we use national service as a strategy? Does not happen. At least it didn't for many years. So that was very frustrating to me. And I even remember being involved with a group of education organizations, the kind of the brand name ones you've all heard of, the teachers unions and the school boards associations and principals associations, and sitting in a room with them trying to figure out how do we crack this nut of kids not being able to read. And we kind of had, what do teachers need to do? What do parents need to do? What do school administrators and school board members need to do? And nobody, and I said, well, okay, that's great, let's write it all down. And I said, okay, what do we tell ordinary people to do? What can volunteers do? And they looked at me like I had three heads, because that's not a question that comes up among people who are trying to solve the reading crisis, or at least it didn't 15 years ago. So here we are, fast forward, all these great solutions out there, and people don't know about it, and they are not thinking about how do we invest in this as a strategy to solve problems. So I decided to write this book to kind of try to tell that story. I also thought it would be helpful, and it's turning out to be the case, that a lot of people who work in one program don't know about other programs. So, even within the service field, just because you're doing foster grandparents doesn't mean you know a thing about AmeriCorps, and just because you're in the NCCC doesn't mean you know what VISTA does. So, there's all these programs, they all got different names, and they don't know what each other is doing. So this is another reason. So even for people within the service field who have, as we say, drunk the Kool-Aid, it's sort of an attempts to kind of educate around these things. So I looked across, sort of on the getting things done side, I looked across the sort of fields and tried to think about, like, what are the unique roles that volunteers and national service members are playing that are different than what professionals do. And that's important because I don't believe that we could get rid of all these programs and just replace them with volunteers, because I think that that would be not effective in most cases. So you have to think about, we have paid staff, and then we have people who are serving because of they care and they want to make a difference. Maybe they're traditional volunteers, meaning maybe they're serving part-time, they're not getting any compensation, or they're getting just like their travel reimbursement or something. Those are folks that are part of this movement, as are people who are like in AmeriCorps getting a stipend to live on and an education award when they conclude their service. So it's a whole spectrum. So those are all people who are serving and can be useful in solving problems, but they don't replace like the paid staff that you might, they're not going to replace the doctors and nurses at the hospital or the social workers or any of the teachers, unless they're Teach for America. That's a whole other conversation. So here's some of the categories I came up with. The first, it's a basic human resource solution. So there's two types of human resources most organizations need. One is the professional help, people who have real skills. So in the history of volunteering, what's the profession that tends to get that the most? Lawyers, that's right, it's pro bono lawyers. And that's been a part of the sort of ethic of being a lawyer for a very, very long time, many decades at least. And it's now sort of taken for granted in the legal profession. But we got a lot of other kinds of professionals nowadays. There's advertising professionals, and there are medical professionals, and there are people who do, computers, and, you name it. There's a profession for it. And what if every one of those organizations, of those professions, had the same ethic as in the law, where part of what you did as your being in that field was you gave back by contributing some of your services for free. So that's one thought. And the other thought is sometimes it's just a many pairs of hands solution. You have a need, and you can't afford to pay 100 people to show up and carry it out, but you can get 100 volunteers to show up and do it. So a lot of the traditional volunteer positions actually do fall into this category because there's sort of like this least common denominator volunteering. But smart programs are realizing that you can train people, and they can be this amazing labor force and actually be a part of a major solution to solving a problem. So going back to the reading question, which my friends in my education associations don't think there was any role. Well, it turns out here's a program called Jumpstart. And Jumpstart takes college students, and they volunteer in Head Start centers and other preschools with low-income kids. And what happens in those centers is, yes, they do have professionals, but they are, they may have one professional for every 10 or 12 kids. And it's really hard to give a kid one-on-one attention. And you got a bunch of 3- and 4-year-olds, they need one-on-one attention. So Jumpstart comes in, and twice a week, these young people from the colleges who have been trained in how to read with kids and how to promote literacy are working in one-on-one in small groups with these kids. And Jumpstart, which is an AmeriCorps program, has done evaluations comparing those kids who've gotten this extra help with the kids who are in the regular Head Start classroom who aren't getting it. And those Jumpstart kids are reading ready at much higher rates. They are going to kindergarten with all the skills they need to become readers. So it's just a simple strategy, and it's one that's very scalable, but it has to be done in an intentional way. So that's an example of the many pairs of hands. I'll give you another example of pro bono, which I don't have a slide for. A lot of the folks who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan are in need of mental health services, but they might be uncomfortable going to traditional sources. Their families may be in need of mental health services, and especially if they've got to live in a girlfriend or a significant other, boyfriend, those folks are not eligible for services from the military or VA, and yet there's a great need. So this program called Give an Hour is enlisting the mental health professional field to contribute 1 hour a week to somebody who falls into those categories so that they can get, professional mental health assistance in a confidential way. And it's, very successful, and the people in the mental health field like to do this. They feel good about it, and it's providing a resource to certainly a very deserving community. So we'll come back to veterans later, but I wanted to share that because any field could do that. The next sort of category I have is extra caring. And, I think about that when you really, the fact that somebody is volunteering and can put a little extra time and personal attention into something, a person who needs help, that actually makes a huge difference. And any of you who are working in, the healthcare field or in even teaching, et cetera, it's like you've got a lot to cover. You've got to get your patients in and out. You've got to cover all the material in the classroom, and, name the fields. If you're a social worker, you've got way too many people you're dealing with, and it's really hard to give that extra time and attention. So, mentoring programs often play this role. I love foster grandparents. The first program I ever saw when I was a Kennedy staffer was a foster grandparent program in Massachusetts, and it was during the time when there were a lot of crack babies, and they were in the hospitals because their mothers had abandoned them, and they were probably never going to leave the hospitals, honestly. They had so many health problems. And the nurses who were taking care of them, they monitored them. They all had lots of little wires on them and tubes, and it was really tragic to see, but they didn't really have time to spend holding these babies. So the foster grandparents would come in and they would sit with the babies and just hold them. Now, I'm a big queen of measurable outcomes, and I can't give you the measurable outcomes on that, but aren't you glad that those ladies were there holding those babies? I mean, maybe they're the only people who did. So, that extra caring is really important. But there's other ways that the extra caring can really be valuable. So I'll give you an example of another program that's made great use of VISTA, as well as AmeriCorps support, and as well as college volunteers, and it's called Lift Communities. And it was started by a girl who was at Yale, and she had wanted to volunteer, and she didn't really want to do mentoring. She wanted to really help. She had done a little bit of mentoring and realized that there are all these other problems that these families that she was working with had, and she couldn't address them. So she created this program called Lift, so that you would get college students who were pretty technology savvy and pretty smart, and put them in centers that were anybody who had a problem could come to. And these were people often who were, about to become homeless because they were going to get evicted, or they'd lost their job, or their child had health needs that they didn't know what to do about. And realizing that in communities, there's all these services out there. And they're sitting right there, except for if you are a person who is in dire straits, you might not have a computer to search for the services you need. You might not know that just down the street there's a church that can give you emergency assistance so you don't lose your house. And they might not know that you could, get housing, from somewhere. You just don't know that if you're a person who's really struggling. But these college kids were trained, and they had databases, and they were eager, and they wouldn't just treat you like you're a number. They would sit with you and help you write your resume and help you look for jobs and do those kinds of whatever it takes stuff that you wouldn't get with a social worker who has got a caseload of 200 families. So now Lyft has grown, it's all over the country, and they're staffed by professional social workers who are kind of like the backup, who make sure that if there's somebody who actually really needs professional help, they aren't sitting with a student who can't help them. But the students are able to do lots and lots of these more routine things. And they're even able to go that extra mile where, like in Washington, D.C., we have Section 8 housing, and you can get vouchers, and families who are eligible for vouchers get the vouchers, and they're not given a list of where they can take them to actually get housing. So the folks at Lyft kind of said, boy, we would really like you, housing department, to give us a list of all the housing that our people can go to. Because think about it, you have a housing voucher, you probably don't have a car, you probably have 2 kids in tow, and you're probably trying to figure out how to take 3 buses to go look at an apartment that may or may not have already been rented, and it's not a good situation. So when the housing department said, oh, we can't keep that list current, it changes so much, the kids at Georgetown just put their own list together, got on the phone, called all the landlords and made their own list. So now they have the better list. So, the fact that people have that sort of energy and idealism and extra caring is a huge asset in solving this particular problem, and we ought to have this everywhere. It would be a lot more efficient, right? It might save money, too, if people aren't knocking on the doors of programs that don't have any room for them, et cetera. So that's another example. I also think there's something to this idea of bonding social capital, which is kind of a jargony academic way of saying the ties that knit communities together and cause them to want to help each other. If you think about a lot of communities, especially those that are in great need, they have assets. And it's not that the people are there don't care, but sometimes they need, it helps to be able to be organized in a way to solve problems. It also sometimes helps if there's people within the community who have credibility and they know their neighbors or they speak Spanish or Hmong or whatever it is that the community speaks, and they can, in a way that's not like, here, we're here from the suburbs and we're here to help, that you can use that kind of community knowledge and credibility in a very powerful way to change behaviors and outcomes. So here's an example. It also might result in a more sustainable solution, because if, the corporate volunteers come in and leave, who's left holding the reins? So here's an example of a program I'm sure you've heard of called Kaboom. And Kaboom builds playgrounds, and they raise their money almost all from corporations who sponsor the playgrounds, and then the corporate volunteers kind of show up and they help build the playgrounds, and they've got all kinds of skills, so that kind of pro bono, they know how to wield the hammer and, do all the power tools and things that I would never want to touch. But they're awesome at it. But, they go in and build the playground. It's really important to have the people from the community who are part of it. So the kids in the community help design the playground, and the families in the neighborhood come out and build right alongside the corporate volunteers, which makes it better for the corporate volunteers, and it makes it a lot better for the families who are there, because they have that sense that they can do something that's going to have an impact, and that once they've worked together and helped to plan a very complicated project, they can do other stuff. And Daryl Hammett, who's the founder of Kaboom, is a good friend of mine, and he tells the story of 2 playgrounds that were built in Connecticut in the same town in the same weekend. One of them was a Kaboom playground that was built by this method I'm talking about. The other was a municipal playground built by government workers. He came back a year later, and which playground do you think was pristine and being used and, in great condition? It was the Kaboom playground. Kids all over it, no litter, no graffiti. He visited the municipal playground, and it was a mess. It was in disrepair. There were, signs that gangs were using it. It was really not a situation. It really was a situation that dramatically showed the power of having communities, use their own assets in important ways. On the other hand, sometimes communities need extra help, and we just have to appreciate that. And so I think of this as sort of bridging social capital, where if you are living in a neighborhood that's low income and has a low education level, let's say you're a kid there, you might not know anybody besides your teacher who went to college. So when it comes time for you to go to college yourself, it's really hard to get navigation help. And you can apply that thinking, if you're trying to find a job, and the only people you know who have jobs have, poorly paying jobs, you can't get a network to, you can't get to that better paying job in a different, realm. So those kinds of relationships, has anybody here ever gotten a job because somebody gave them advice or pointed them to it or introduced them? I know it's like how I've gotten every job I've ever had. So, that's actually a really important part of finding jobs. So that's why some of these mentoring programs and things like that are really important. And here's a program I really like, College Summit. And what College Summit does is kind of uses both bridging and bonding social capital together. So one insight that J.B. Schramm, who founded College Summit, had was that often it's like a whole school that has either the culture of we're going to go to college, or a culture of we're not college material, and in fact, we better look, we don't value our education. And that happens. And the culture of the school makes a difference about whether kids try hard or don't bother. And he had the idea that if so many college access programs cream these kids. They pick the kids in the poor schools, and they say, well, you guys, you 5A students, we're going to really help you, and we're going to give you the special program. You're special. When in fact what you need to do is tell everybody they're going to college. It's not because they're special, it's because they're going to college. And so the way to do that is two things, two sets of volunteers. So the first set of volunteers are a group of kids who are maybe not the A students in the school. They might be the B students, they might be the C students, but they're students who are kind of connected and influential in other ways. And they take those kids and they make them peer leaders. So they don't get any money, they don't get anything special, but they're peer leaders. The one thing they do get special, though, is access to a volunteer-run program that happens over the summer for a weekend. And in that program, they are getting professionals, parents who help their kids apply to college, professional writers, lawyers, people who are pretty savvy about how to fill out applications and write essays, sit with these peer leaders, and in their summer of their junior year, they make sure these kids get their essays written, and they make sure they fill out the financial aid forms, and they make sure that they know how to fill out the college applications and what the process is. So all those are just volunteers, but they're savvy, knowledgeable volunteers who get the college process. And the kids go back, the peer leaders go back, and in the fall, they become ambassadors to the school to tell everybody in the school, you can apply, I applied to college, you can apply to college. And they're getting blow you away results. Like they're increasing college going rates by double-digit percentages in these schools where this operates. And it's a simple idea, but it provides just that extra thing that these families need to make sure that we don't lose whole generations of low-income kids who could otherwise be successful. So that's another example. Now, I like to share all these getting things done examples because I think the thing people don't know about volunteering is that they actually solve problems. But there's another aspect of volunteering in national service that I'm sure many of you know about if you've ever volunteered yourselves, and I think probably most of you have, and that is the personal change that it brings. And we certainly heard about that a few minutes ago. So I think we actually should be targeting service resources towards certain populations for whom the opportunity to serve can be transformational. So one example is young people. So the power of purpose is what we're talking about. And this, kids who are, especially like that kind of young teen age, that's when you're making your choice about like who you are. Are you a person who's going to be a problem solver, a credit to your community, somebody who matters, or are you going to be somebody who maybe drifts around and doesn't do so well? So a lot of service learning, and there's funding in the Corporation for National Community Service for service learning through the Learn and Serve America program, is aimed at trying to get young people to get engaged in service through their schools so that they have that powerful experience of helping others. And I like to share this program called Manateens because it's kind of, they succeeded despite the adults. So in Manatee County, Florida, there were young people who wanted to volunteer. And they were like 13 years old. And they went out and knocked on the doors of nonprofits. And the nonprofits said, sorry, you're 13, we don't have any program for you, go away. And they were disappointed, but they were not deterred. So they started their own program called Manateens, and they made their own service projects. So they're like little social entrepreneurs. They would see a need, and they would organize a program around it. So here's like just one tiny example. One of the kids read in the newspaper that a lot of older people who got Meals on Wheels were giving their meals to their dogs and cats because they couldn't afford dog and cat food. And they were kind of heartbroken about this because it both meant that dogs and cats were eating people food, which we all know they're not supposed to, but also that the older people were giving away their meals, so what were they eating? And so that broke their hearts. So what did they do? They started Pet Meals on Wheels. Simple concept. They got people to donate pet food, they delivered the pet food, and they've kept this going for years and years and years, and now adults are trying to replicate this program in other cities because it's like a simple thing, but the kids made it up. And they've made up a dozen other great ideas that I don't have time to tell you about, but the fact that they were turned away at the doors of nonprofits meant we've benefited from all of their amazing energy. And these kids are doing great. And at points in time, 2/3 of the kids in Manatee County are serving in this program. So if we ever needed to look at an example of how you do this at scale, I think that's a really interesting one. Of course, there's other programs like Youth Build, which is a youth corps where young people, both who are often, they've dropped out of school, they're coming out of prison, they have been in gangs, they're trying to turn their lives around. It's hard to get a job if you're those kids, and it's hard to go back to school because probably you didn't fit so well in the school you were going in, and that's why you dropped out. So Youth Build gets these young people, and they teach them carpentry and building trades skills. They apply those skills as they're learning them to building low-income housing and building community buildings and doing other good works in the community, and they're getting them their GEDs or their diplomas in some cases. So we're combining all those things, and a lot of them are getting AmeriCorps Ed Awards, so they're finishing the program. They started the program as an ex-offender who couldn't get a job and was nothing, and they end the program as a leader in their community who's going to go to college. And I think that's really a great use of government resources to make that happen. Other programs like Community Health Corps, which is a national program that community health centers run, and they basically have young people and people from the community of all ages serve as AmeriCorps members in this program. And we all know that healthcare is an area where there's more to be done than diagnose and treat. You have to sign people up for health insurance, for public health insurance if it's available. You need to make sure that they can get to their appointments. You need to try to make the communities healthier in a whole variety of ways. And that's what the Health Corps members do, which is really terrific. And they're all AmeriCorps members. And it's a field that's experiencing large shortages or projected shortages of workers is community health, public health. These guys are going on to health careers. And so it's become a really powerful feeder system for that profession. And then there's Experience Corps, which another program I love. This is a picture of a guy named Val Jackson. And there's a story in my book about what he does. He works in schools, he tutors, and he's that extra pair of hands in the classroom with the teachers who, you've got 30 kids in the classroom and there's 3 of them that are acting up. It's going to make it so everybody else can't learn. And what are your strategies as a teacher? Well, you could, put all your attention on those 3 kids. You can send them to the principal, who's probably got a line out the door. Send them to the guidance counselor, same thing. Or you can have a person like Val Jackson, Experience Corps member. And what he does is, mostly he's tutoring the kids in reading based on a curriculum that's tested. And we actually know that this program nationwide is these kids are outperforming their peers pretty dramatically because of this extra help. But he does this extra thing, which is when he had these 3 little boys, the teacher said, you got to deal with these 3 boys. I got to take care of the class. Can you give them some attention? So he said, I took the angriest little boy. He seemed really unhappy. And I walked him around the school and I asked him, well, why are you so angry? What's wrong? And he said, my grandma just died and I'm really sad. And so he talked to this kid for half an hour about how he could remember his grandma and, let's talk about some of the good things you had and let's make sure you remember those things. And then he said, it's okay, can we go back to classroom? Are you ready? And the little boy said yes. No more behavior problems for that day. So, it's that extra stuff. Now, this is under the power of purpose, so the other thing about Experience Corps is that for the older people who are serving in this program, and you have to be 55 plus to serve in it, they're living longer, they're happier, they're healthier, mentally and physically, because they're doing this. And this is a random control study, so it's done by Johns Hopkins, like serious evaluation people. So it's not only helping these kids in the classroom, it's this powerful way for older people to have that sense of purpose that makes them live better lives. So this is my last example, and then I'll just wrap up. Mission Continues is a great example of a program for veterans. And I have to say, a lot of people over the years have recently been pushing veterans service, civilian service. And I initially was kind of opposed to this, because I'm thinking, okay, these guys and gals have gone to, put their lives on the line. They've given years. They're coming back wounded. Like, why would we ask them to give more? Let somebody else have a turn. It turns out that that's exactly what we should be doing, is asking them to give more because of the power of actually being able to serve and be useful. So this guy, Eric Greitens, is a Navy SEAL, and he was walking around Walter Reed, kind of volunteering there, and he started asking the wounded veterans who were there, well, what do you want? Like, how could you how could your healing process be advanced? And they all said, we want to go back to the front. We want to go do, and they'd lost a leg. They're not going back to the front. They want to be useful. They want to contribute. And so he started this thing called the Mission Continues to basically create fellowships for wounded veterans to be able to serve their communities. And the woman on the left, Sonia, is deaf because she was in 2 different explosions in Iraq. And she was shut in basically, in her house until she got this opportunity. And then she became a volunteer at Big Brothers Big Sisters, which she has continued after the fellowship, and now she's going to go on and become a registered nurse. And it's made a transformational impact on her life, and there's many, many other examples of this. So if we start thinking about, when service can make a difference for the people who serve, this is where we ought to be targeting a lot of resources, I think. So the good news is, a few years ago, Congress passed the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act, so named because Orrin Hatch, who, as you probably know, is a conservative Republican from Utah, suggested that should be the name of the act because it was, as Kennedy, it was really his last major bill, and it was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, and it does target veterans, it does target older people, it does target young people for service, which is great. And it's been exciting because we've been able to see tremendous growth in the field, and we've been able to see service being directed at these really important issues that I've been talking about. So we now have an education corps. But, that's not all. We've also seen a real validation for service in some different fields, and I think education is the one where we've had the most traction. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this thing called the Innovation Fund at the Department of Education, but it's a competition for major dollars for nonprofits that are working in the education space. And one of the top awards was given to a program called City Year, which you have here. And I have to disclose, I'm now a trustee of City Year nationally, although I wasn't when I wrote the book. But City Year has really focused its energy on turning around the lowest performing, basically dropout factories in the country and their feeder schools. And there's a very well-researched methodology to look for early warning indicators, which are for dropping out, which are attendance, behavior, bad behavior, and basically course failure. And so those kids who start exhibiting those attributes are getting this sort of very sneaky help from the Corps members who are near peers. They're young, so the kids kind of look up to them. If you're like 13 and you've got this kind of cool 21-year-old who is paying attention to you, that's pretty neat. And by being able to work with the kids that the school has identified as being vulnerable, they're starting to get pretty amazing outcomes in reducing the dropout rate. So in the I3 fund, which was tremendously competitive, City Year is one of the top grantees. So I think that's really exciting, and it says to me, somebody's paying attention finally. Another example is cities of service. So Mayor Bloomberg in New York a few years ago decided to make service a strategy that he was going to use in the city of New York, and he appointed a chief service officer who created a whole set of initiatives, and it's really going well. And so he and the Rockefeller Foundation are now funding 20 other cities to do the same thing, including here in Little Rock, which Michael Drake is the chief service officer, and I'm not going to spoil your unveil of your plan by saying what you're going to do, but I will tell you about what another city is doing, which is Philadelphia, which was in round 1 of the grant, so they're farther along. And Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia has this dropout concern as well, because basically the dropout rate, only 60% of kids are graduating, so he decided to reduce it by 20%, and he's using service as one of his key strategies. So they've created this graduation coaches initiative where they're asking all the adults in the city of Philadelphia to step forward, get trained, and pick a kid that's in their life, maybe a neighbor, a nephew, a brother, and make sure that kid graduates. And they have access to some resources that will help them, even if they're not too knowledgeable about how to make this happen, so that they can have guided conversations and find the resources and help that the kids need. And we'll see if this works. We don't know. But it's something that could happen at a very large scale. And they're using like Tupperware party design to kind of get people trained. So they're asking people to host parties to get people to come in and get trained, and they're giving them a little money to pay for the food. And it seems like it's taken off, so we'll see what happens. So I'm going to conclude just to tell you you a little bit about one other initiative called Reimagining Service, which is really focusing on the investment that you get from investing in service, the return that you get. And they've done research that shows that organizations that have from 10 or more volunteers are basically equally as effective as organizations that don't have the volunteers, but they cost half as much. So at a time when we're really worried about budgets, we ought to be really thinking about service as a strategy. And who's thinking about budgets? Well, Congress. And $61 billion is the number that the House Republicans are trying to cut out of the federal budget. And I know sometimes when I hear these numbers, they're kind of meaningless. So $61 billion is over 50 times the entire budget of the Corporation for National and Community Service. And yet they've decided to make the corporation one of the basically agencies that it's going to eliminate to kind of make up this number. And I think this is crazy because look at the return that you get from a service. And if we get rid of all these government programs, who's going to help? You know, Ronald Reagan, when he wanted to cut the federal government, said, oh, the charities will pick up the slack, we'll have volunteers do it. But he didn't want to invest in that. You know, now we've got this infrastructure that really works. If you go to almost any organization, grassroots or national, your Habitat for Humanity or your local CDC, you're going to probably find AmeriCorps in there. You're going to find volunteers working there. It's ubiquitous. If we take away the tiny amount of resources that you need to kind of have staff to oversee this and to get the supplies and make sure that people are deployed effectively, you know, if we have these programs and if the programs go away and you kind of say, oh, everybody go help somebody, you know, is that really going to be a good response? So we ought to be tripling the budget of the corporation, not eliminating it. It's just crazy. So there is a group that's trying to save service in America. They have a website if you're interested, saveservice.org, and they've already organized lots of stuff to try to fight back. And one of the leading groups of it is a group called Voices for National Service. And I'm donating the profits from my book this year to that group. So if you, maybe you didn't want to buy a book, but maybe you'll think about it if you care about this. So I'm going to stop here, have a couple minutes to answer questions if there are any, and I really appreciate your being here.
Allow me to introduce myself. Al Schneider. I served as the Executive Director of the Arkansas State Service Commission,
Awesome.
1999, 2009.
Great.
And I just can't say how grateful I am for you and Deb Jospin and others who have been leaders in developing service in America. With your leave, I'd like to just give a couple of things, local
That'd be
flavor
great. That'd be
to
great.
service in Arkansas. First of all, City Year, wonderful, welcome. You tied in perfectly with the priority that citizens of Arkansas identified for service, that is education, and so we're proud to have you here. Others who are not as visible all over the state, 250 to 400 AmeriCorps members per year, focusing mainly on education. They're dealing with the different dynamic pre-K through 4, basic literacy skills, doing wonderful work. Another program, Northwest Arkansas, huge Hispanic population. They're recruiting bilingual volunteers, and they're helping teachers and parents communicate. And the transformational experience that AmeriCorps can provide. There was a young lady who was doing janitorial work in one of our educational service cooperatives. That young lady served 2 years in AmeriCorps as a tutor. She is now a teacher with an MA, specializing in technology and education. She's making a difference in people's lives in a whole different way now. I'm so proud that you came to Arkansas. I'm so proud for all you continue to give. Thank you.
Behind you.
Shirley, thank you again for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. What you said about the silos is very true, even among groups that use AmeriCorps. It's very well used here in Arkansas. But I was curious if you could speak a little bit about, with the challenges around funding and the fact that we need to all speak out for AmeriCorps National Service at this time. Do you have some words of wisdom as to how that voice is carrying across states and how we need to do that even here in Arkansas?
Oh, thank you. It's really important for everybody to speak up. So not just programs, which in some ways are sort of seen as self-serving, although they should speak up and speak up a lot, but also, parents, ordinary citizens, their nonprofit partners. It's going to, right now, there's kind of two targets. One are the Republicans who want to eliminate it, and the others are the Democrats who have to decide which of their babies they want to keep, which is a heartbreaking process a lot of them are going through. So everybody needs to hear from people who care about this, and there's lots of ways to do it. There's the Save Service Coalition is organizing events and other things, so if you kind of get connected to that, you'll hear about what they're targeting today. Just write your congressman in the most traditional way. It's like really helpful, and especially if you tell your story. Why do you care? Make it personal. It's not necessarily a form letter. I think that's super helpful. And if you've got a really powerful story to tell, make sure you send a copy of it to the folks at Save Service, because they're passing these stories around now to reporters and to other influential people as part of the sales tactic. And and I'm hearing great things, like in Iowa, a group of Catholic school first graders showed up at their congressman's office to tell him that they wanted to keep their foster granny, and if they didn't get to keep their foster granny, one of them had his piggy bank, and he said, I'm going to give her this money. And, those kinds of things make a difference. But those are the kinds of stories we're hearing. And, the stories you hear about an individual person and how their life was changed, whether somebody helped them or they helped somebody else, we don't know these in Washington. In Washington, people think AmeriCorps is? It's like, oh, those are those Clinton ground troops that are like fueling the, Democratic elections. They don't really have a sense that this is something that matters in their own districts, and it's not political, and it's making a difference. So telling those stories is really important. So I appreciate the question, because we need, especially states like Arkansas, we definitely need to hear from.
David.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School, and thank you for coming tonight. Prior to coming here, I taught a service learning course in high school, and so I'm very interested in the topic. And I'd like a few thoughts or reactions that you might have to mandatory guided service or service learning in high school, particularly the mandatory part.
Yeah, I don't really support mandatory, AmeriCorps type programs because we can't afford them, but I do think it should be mandatory in schools. I think maybe there should be some, what happens though is often a school district will make it mandatory and then they won't put any resources behind it and they just send out, that's what kind of happens in Maryland. We have a 100%, graduation requirement. You have to do 75 hours of service, but, it's kind of up to the parents to figure out what their kids are going to do, which may be not so good. A really well thought out service learning program within the schools can be a great way to engage kids with their education. And I know I've seen it with my own kids that when we had this like service learning program in the 4th grade where the kids grew these little, I can't remember the name of the fish, but they're like some really important fish that's endangered in the Potomac, and they grew them from eggs in the classroom. And then the day of the release, when they got to release them into the Potomac, and this was all about learning how fish grow, and I don't know, stuff I don't understand. Shad, you're right, it was shad. The day of the shad release, it was like the biggest day of the year. And my kid would not let me there's a huge traffic jam getting to the shad release. We were like late, and he's like in the car crying that he's going to miss the shad release. And they each got a little cup of shad, and they got to like dump it in the Potomac. You would have thought that they, solved poverty in America. It was really awesome. And if you can get excited about biology because you're growing shad and putting them in the Potomac, to me that's like evidence that we ought to be investing in it. Not just because we care about service, but we care about education.
Shameen.
Thank you so much for being here. I am also a student at the Clinton School, first year, and I'm from Kenya. And last month, a family in Atlanta set up a community service scholarship to be awarded to a student at a high school in Kenya. But we don't have the culture, definitely the government doesn't do, we don't have any kind of national service projects or even the concept of volunteering. So in your experience, I know City Year has a program in South Africa, but have you worked with any other governments that were interested or any other international organizations that were interested in engaging young students? Because where we are now, it's trying to define culturally what volunteering would mean to the students.
Oh, interesting. So South Africa does have City Year, and it's been pretty successful there. A lot of countries actually have national service at a larger scale than we do because they have mandatory military service and an opt-out if you have a conscientious objector. So like Italy, has a big national service program. It's mostly military. It's a little trickier in the more volunteer, community-based type stuff. And in a lot of countries, there is lots of volunteering going on. They just don't call it that. They would be helping out their neighbors because you help out your neighbors, or the villages can't function if everybody doesn't do their turn at the well or whatever. And so they don't call it volunteering. So part of it, I think, is a translation issue to kind of recognize things. A great organization that does, I don't do a lot of work with other countries, but there's an organization called Innovation and Civic Participation, and they work with countries they are like consultants to the globe. They go all over the world to help governments and local organizations set up programs like this, so I would urge you to check them out because I think they could maybe help you. Thanks.
Johnny.
Thank you. I've worked with Department of Human Services, and I've worked with Al and Edit, and also I did some volunteer work a couple of years ago when a tornado went through Mena, Arkansas, and had to sign the AmeriCorps form to do the work. My question is, I've worked with previous state agencies with some of the FEMA people who are contract people after the storms, and I would feel a program like this would do much better than people who try to ride out how long they can work at a place to maximize how much they get paid. And have y'all tried to coordinate something like that? Because I feel that would be especially good in Tornado Alley especially.
That's a great idea. There are a few programs that do a particularly good job in that space. One is the National Civilian Community Corps, the NCCC. They specialize in disaster response, so they travel around, and whenever there's a big need, they'll come. And they'll often help organize other volunteers so that, because what happens, everybody shows up and you got to have somebody telling them what to do. Red Cross and a lot of the, volunteer VOADs and those kind of things try to play that role. But I think it's really an important function for people to get trained in how to do, CERT training. So, because most it's not even a disaster. It might be a house fire. It might be just somebody slipped and fell. It's usually a relative or a neighbor that's the first on the scene, not a trained responder. So we all need to get trained if we care about our families and our neighbors. But for that long-term response, that's a special area for AmeriCorps. It's a great way for AmeriCorps members to serve. And there are programs that, a lot of stuff after Katrina, a lot of the long-term rebuilding. In Mississippi, for example, Senator Cochran, who's a Republican, has become the co-chair of the National Service Caucus in the Senate because he saw what a powerful effort happened in Mississippi after Katrina, and so he was sold on it. So you've got the right idea, and we need to do a lot more. It's a great role.
We have time for one more.
I'm Corey Biggs. I'm also a student here at the Clinton School, so thanks for coming.
Thanks.
And I'm also a recent graduate of the law school here in Little Rock, so
Great.
thanks especially for your kind words about the legal profession. I agree with you that it would be great if more professional fields valued volunteerism. It would also be great if more lawyers valued volunteerism. But my question is about something that you said at the very beginning of your remarks in saying that in your eyes, national service had in a way reduced the number of college-going young people. I wanted you to expand on that, and then depending on how you answer that, this could be a follow-up or a completely separate
Okay.
question. Could you talk about your experience of the educational benefits of being in college as a young person versus the educational benefits of being in service, something more hands-on and outside
Interesting.
of the traditional education framework?
So the original comment was in response to the proposal that the DLC made that said they're going to eliminate all financial aid programs. Okay, so no more Pell Grants, no more loans, no more government loans. And the only people who are going to get money for college from the government are those people who do a year or more of service. And there was a big backlash against that idea because for a lot of people, that's just not realistic, and the more time you put between leaving high school and starting college, the less likely you are to go. So the feeling was that that was actually going to exacerbate the problem, not help, and I think that's true. But I think that it's also a tremendously good thing for young people to spend a year doing service, either between high school and college or after college, because it's really hard to know what you want to be when you grow up. Right? I mean, I didn't know. And, I learned what I wanted to do because I got to do a 6-month internship in Washington. But having these programs out there, and now gap years are more and more attractive and sought after to have that year between, one or the other. It's starting to become a much more accepted practice. And I think that the chance to kind of see how the world works will enliven the college education later. And I went to Smith College, and we had a program there called Ada Comstock Scholars. And Adas were non-traditional students who had taken who were 5 years older than traditional students or more, and they got to go to what's a pretty traditional liberal arts college. Having those people in the classroom made it a whole different experience because they were not like starry-eyed 18-year-olds. They were people with real experience. So the conversations were better and the education was better even for us starry-eyed 18-year-olds. So I think it's actually a good thing to get out there. And if you went to law school, you know that law schools are full of people who just couldn't think of anything better to do and are going to get out and be really sorry they're lawyers. I know a lot of them because I went to law school too. So that was a great, great question.
Well, Shirley, thank you so much for coming back, and copies of the book are over here if you want to come and chat with her, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank
Thanks.
you.